All right, America, buckle up because we're about to dive headfirst into a topic that's more taboo than a raccoon in a hot tub. Communism in the good old US of A. But before you grab your red-baiting bingo cards, let's try and learn a thing or two, shall we? Communist rallies in the United States have a surprisingly long and, frankly, fascinating history. So, whether you think Karl Marx was a misunderstood genius or the inventor of bad hair days, join me as we unpack 10 facts about communist rallies in the United States that might just make you spit out your lukewarm capitalist beverage. Here are 10 notable facts. Now, the story of communist rallies in America really kicks off with the birth of the Communist Party USA, or CPUSA, back in 1919. Picture this. World War I's just wrapped up, the Russian Revolution's in full swing, and suddenly, the idea of workers seizing the means of production doesn't seem so outlandish anymore. The CPUSA emerged from a split in the Socialist Party of America, with one side thinking, hey, maybe those Bolsheviks are onto something. Their early rallies were a mix of fiery speeches, impassioned calls for workers' solidarity, and probably a decent amount of terrible folk music. They were about advocating for radical change in a country still grappling with the legacy of slavery and the exploitation of its working class. It was a time of immense social and political upheaval, and the CPUSA, with its rallies and protests, was right there in the thick of it, trying to steer America towards a workers' paradise. Now here's where things get interesting. In the 1920s and 30s, the CPUSA did something truly remarkable for its time. It actively fought for civil rights. The CPUSA was out there on the front lines, opposing lynchings, advocating for workplace integration, and demanding equal rights for all. They recognized the inherent link between economic justice and racial justice, a connection that many other political organizations were either too blind or too cowardly to acknowledge. They organized rallies and protests, published newspapers and pamphlets, and provided legal aid to victims of racial discrimination. This commitment to social justice, even in the face of intense opposition, is a crucial part of the CPUSA's history, and it's something that often gets overlooked or deliberately downplayed. Now, if you want an example of the CPUSA putting their money where their mouth was when it came to civil rights, look no further than the case of the Scottsboro Boys. This wasn't just a local news story, this was a national scandal that exposed the deep-seated racism of the American justice system. In 1931, 9 black teenagers were falsely accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama. The evidence against them was flimsy at best, non-existent at worst, but that didn't stop an all-white jury from convicting them and sentencing them to death. Enter the CPUSA. They saw this case for what it was, a blatant miscarriage of justice fueled by racism and prejudice. They rallied to the defense of the Scottsboro Boys, organizing protests, raising funds for their legal defense, and publicizing the case internationally. The case dragged on for years, with multiple trials, appeals, and retrials, becoming a rallying cry for civil rights activists across the country. Chapter 4. From breadlines to picket lines, the CPUSA and the Great Depression. Now, the 1930s saw America plunged into the Great Depression, and let me tell you, it wasn't exactly a roaring good time for anyone. Unemployment was rampant, poverty was widespread, and people were desperate for change. The CPUSA saw this crisis as an opportunity to mobilize the working class and push for radical reforms. They organized unemployed councils across the country, providing support and assistance to those hit hardest by the economic downturn. These councils weren't just about handing out soup and sympathy. They organized protests and demonstrations demanding jobs, unemployment insurance, and other forms of government assistance. The CPUSA's activism during the Great Depression is credited with helping to pave the way for the New Deal, which brought about sweeping social and economic reforms. Chapter 5, Red Scare, Part 2, McCarthyism and the Decline of the CPUSA. Now, just as the CPUSA was starting to gain some real traction, the Red Scare hit. And let me tell you, it hit hard. The post-World War II era saw a wave of anti-communist paranoia sweep across America, fueled by fears of Soviet infiltration and the spread of communism globally. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a man whose name is now synonymous with baseless accusations and political witch hunts, led the charge, claiming that communists had infiltrated every level of American society, from the State Department to Hollywood. The CPUSA, already a target of suspicion and hostility, became public enemy number one. Their members were blacklisted, harassed, and even imprisoned under the Smith Act, which made it illegal to advocate for the overthrow of the government. The CPUSA was effectively driven underground, its membership decimated by fear and repression. Chapter 6. Keeping the Dream Alive. The CPUSA in the later 20th century. Now, despite facing government crackdowns and a healthy dose of public disapproval, the CPUSA didn't exactly disappear after the Red Scare. They were bruised, battered, and definitely smaller, but they were far from finished. They continued to operate, albeit on a much smaller scale, throughout the latter half of the 20th century. They organized around labor rights, opposed the Vietnam War, and participated in the civil rights movement, often working alongside other progressive groups. They spoke out against racial injustice, economic inequality, and US foreign policy, often finding themselves at odds with both the political establishment and the prevailing public sentiment. Their story during this period is one of resilience, adaptation, and a continued commitment to their core principles, even in the face of adversity. Chapter 7. One Nation, Many Issues, the CPUSA in the 21st Century. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the CPUSA is still active, using social media and online platforms to spread their message. They've participated in protests like the One Nation Working Together rally in Washington, D.C. in 2010. The CPUSA continues to advocate for social justice and economic equality, engaging in the political process and raising awareness. Now, it's important to remember that the CPUSA isn't the only communist game in town. The Revolutionary Communist Party, or RCP, is a separate entity with its own distinct ideology and tactics. The RCP, founded in 1975, adheres to the teachings of Marx, Lenin, and Mao Zedong, advocating for a socialist revolution to overthrow the capitalist system. They're known for their tactics have often drawn criticism, even from those sympathetic to their cause. But the RCP remains unapologetic in its pursuit of revolutionary change. While their numbers are relatively small, the RCP's unwavering commitment to revolution and their willingness to challenge the status quo, often in dramatic fashion, make them a persistent, if controversial, presence in American politics. Communist rallies in the United States have evolved over the years. Gone are the days of massive crowds in Madison Square Garden. Today, activism is more likely online, using social media to mobilize supporters and spread awareness. Online forums have become virtual gathering places for discussions and community building. In-person rallies still occur, but the internet has transformed activism. Now, despite its long and complicated history in the United States, the word communist still carries a lot of baggage. It's often used as a pejorative term, a way to discredit opponents and shut down debate. In recent years, we've seen politicians and media figures bandy about the term with reckless abandon, accusing their rivals of being communists or socialists without any real understanding of what those terms actually mean. This kind of rhetoric is not only intellectually lazy, but also dangerous, as it stokes fear and division and undermines meaningful political discourse. The reality is that communism, like any complex ideology, has many different interpretations and variations. We need to be wary of those who use the communist card as a scare tactic, as it often reveals more about their own insecurities and prejudices than it does about their opponents. So, there you have it, folks, a whirlwind tour of communist rallies in the United States. It's a history that's as complex and contradictory as the country itself, full of moments of both inspiration and despair. From the early days of the CPUSA, fighting for labor rights and racial justice, to the online activism of today, communists have played a role, however controversial or misunderstood, in shaping the American political landscape. It's a history that deserves to be remembered, studied, and debated, not swept under the rug or dismissed with simplistic labels.